Now, I got interested in this whole idea because, as I mentioned yesterday, I spent 15 years teaching on the Navajo Nation. I was teaching geology in one of the most geologically spectacular places, the Colorado Plateau. I was teaching essentially Euro-American geology to students who had very different senses of place and who had basically indigenous senses of place. Their cultures were rooted in that place for millennia. Okay, and one of the things that, one of the really major paradoxes that I found very quickly was that my students understood geology intuitively better than any group of students I'd ever worked with, because they spent pretty much most of their lives out on the land, interacting with earth processes, understanding natural environments, really familiar. I could put a bunch of rocks on a table, and even though they had not studied things like texture and composition yet, they could look at those rocks and say, well, I know where you got that from, and they could describe the landform in great detail. And yet, we see a disproportional representation of Native Americans in the geosciences. Even though they make up about 2% of the population, they're even more underrepresented in the geosciences than that. And the question that we were sort of dealing with was, is it because of the way we teach earth science? Are we teaching earth science in a way that actually contradicts or minimizes their sense of place? Now, how can we do that? We can do this quite often unintentionally. Again, we talked about this, for example, presenting differing views on land and resource use. Now, that's not to say, for example, that all Native people are opposed to resource extraction, because they're not. There are plenty who support it, plenty who see it as an economic engine for their communities. But there are also some who see it as an affront. Okay, so we have to take that into account. They're diverse, just like they are in the general population. All right, this is one that I found really interesting. It's metaphors that we use for describing how the Earth works. The Earth is a big, old, and complex system, and when we talk about how the Earth works, we have to resort to metaphors. Okay, and probably many of you have heard this metaphor that the Earth system is a giant machine, right? The interior of the Earth is a heat engine. It takes heat generated from radioactive decay and the primordial heat of the Earth and turns it into motion, turns it into plate tectonics, for example. And the atmosphere is a heat engine that takes the heat of the sun. Okay, well, that's a mechanical metaphor for Earth processes. Most indigenous people use living metaphors. They talk about Mother Earth and Father Sky as the metaphors. They're actually using living systems. So if we describe the Earth as a machine, quite often we could be turning off Native students in that way. And then this is certainly true in the Southwest. I don't know how much it is true in this side of the country, that invariably environmental damage related from resource development, quite often uranium mining and uranium milling, is inextricably linked to earth science. Okay, so if you come into some of these places and say, I'm a geologist, the first thing they'll say is, oh, well, you related to the uranium mining that caused all this damage and caused all this suffering in our community. So these are things that we have to account for in our teaching. So I got interested in this idea of place-based teaching. Place-based teaching is teaching that is explicitly situated in place. Okay, in other words, the objectives are not so much ideas of science. We want them to learn about science. The learning goals, though, are not so much that you're going to learn these particular scientific principles. What you're going to do instead is you're going to learn as much about this place as you can, and we're going to bring in as many different disciplines as are necessary to get the job done. So this is what makes place-based teaching. This sort of characterizes it. It's localized. Okay? It's based in local places and regions. It's experiential. Learners interact with these local landscapes, environments, and communities. Okay, it can also be community-based. It's transdisciplinary. It isn't just earth science. In a way, it's kind of a contradiction. I say this all the time, but I say place-based earth science teaching. In a way, that's kind of a contradiction because earth science is just part of the toolkit that we bring in to understand a place. Culturally valid. What that means, again, is that if there are indigenous ways of knowing the local places, you have to take those into account somehow. You have to understand what these senses of place are. And it promotes environmental and cultural sustainability. That's the idea, is that we want to learn about these places because we want to sustain them in an ecological way as well as a cultural way. Okay, so for example, one of the things we did when I was on the Navajo Nation is we developed a place-based, here we go again, place-based geology course. We called it Sahna Alka, which is Navajo for rock study. That's geology in Navajo. And this is a syllabus. Okay, now normally when you see a syllabus for a college class, it usually consists of a linear list of topics. Okay, we didn't go about it that way. We actually created a graphic syllabus, sort of a schematic depiction of Colorado Plateau geology, which is the place where we were teaching, and we presented the topics in a way that made sense to Navajo culture. We also did it bilingually. We put Navajo language as well as English in there. And that idea is that in a circle. Okay, I don't know how many people are familiar with the traditional home of Navajo people. It's called the Hogan. It's a rounded home. The doorway traditionally always faces east. It faces the rising sun. When you enter a Hogan, you always move in a clockwise direction when you walk around inside it, okay, which is the sunwise direction. So in Navajo culture, whenever you have some kind of a circle, you know you always begin at the top, because east is at the top. We think of north as being the up direction, because we think magnetically. But many indigenous people, east is the up direction, because they're thinking in terms of the sun rising. So east here, so it's up, you make a circle this way, so you progress through the syllabus in a sunwise or clockwise way. And so this turns out to be sort of an interaction, first studying the earth, then interactions between the earth and the sky, and then finally the sky. So these are some of the ways we've incorporated these local ideas of places into curriculum. We did the same thing at the Trail of Time. The interactive geoscience exhibits there along the interpretive trail were very place-based. Okay, again, most of our signage, as I think you can see here, this is an actual cross-section of Grand Canyon geology that was used as a theme throughout. We used colors, we used rock types. We wanted to evoke a very strong sense of the Grand Canyon, even though we were teaching about geologic time in that interpretive exhibit. Okay, so ways that we can leverage the sense of place. I kind of talked about these already. Emphasizing local regional environments, teaching outdoors in the community, integrating locally situated ways. If you're aware of local knowledge, place names, local histories, you want to make sure that these are accounted for. Using both scientific and humanistic ways of knowing. We used a lot of art, we used a lot of literature, we used a lot of quotations about the places that we were teaching about. Guiding learners to consider current environmental economic issues. Okay, that's something you got to tackle head on. Freeman Tilden, right, the great book on interpretation, didn't make any bones about that. You've got to tackle these if you're an interpreter. Promoting creative expression, service learning, and lifelong learning, and most importantly, reveling in the beauty of our places. Okay, I like to talk about beauty. I like to talk about love. There's that affective, that emotional component, the place attachment. Okay, so very quickly, I know I'm starting to run over on time, so why is this not? There we go. Okay, so just, I see why. A little delay there. Okay, so this is sort of a quick example of some of the things we're doing, sort of a montage of what we're doing down at Arizona State to evoke this sense of place. This is the syllabus for the course that I teach now. Since I'm in a place now that isn't so monocultural, when I was on the Navajo Nation, it was very monocultural. At ASU, we have a diverse range of cultures present, so we wanted to make it a little bit more culturally diverse. So this is the syllabus now. You can see this is very evocative of the Southwest, and the topics that we cover are still relevant, particularly to Southwest geology. We still have that sort of cyclical pattern from Mother Earth through Father Sky, and we talk about cielo y tierra, sky and earth, as sort of the organizing theme. Some of the things we do is we get students to creatively express themselves. They do things like create Wikipedia pages and Facebook entries on different parts of the Southwest that interest them. This is an original painting that one of my students created of the Grand Canyon. She did an entire group of paintings on the physiographic provinces of the Southwest. We get students to volunteer in classrooms, do service learning. We talk about topical issues like drought and land use and mining and so on. So these are all ways that we sort of evoke the sense of place of the Southwest. I'm going to go through this real kind of quickly just to point out that there are actual assessment evaluation methods that have been composed to measure sense of place. So we can actually use sense of place as a learning outcome. In other words, when we do our teaching, we do our interpretation, we want people to come out of this with richer meanings and actually stronger emotional attachments to those places. We're trying to teach emotion. Okay, we're trying to teach love and respect for these places. And there are different ways we can do it. We have quantitative surveys. We can observe what goes on in the class or the field. We can do formative. This is going on during the teaching. This is what happens afterwards, interviews and focus groups. We can look at what students produce. We ask them to do sketches. We ask them to do artwork. We can actually look at these things and see how their depth of understanding of these places changes through time. And I sort of throw these out real quickly. If anybody would like to talk about any of these ways that we can use sense of place to evaluate what we're doing, I'd be happy to go into more detail, but just I sort of want to finish with making this connection to interpretation. As many of the people in this room can tell me better than I can tell you, right? Interpretation is the teaching approach that's indigenous to parks. Okay. I want to posit here that when we talk about interpretation, we're actually talking about place-based education. Talking about it by a different name. Okay, so there's Freeman Tilden up there, Interpreting Our Heritage, the classic book on interpretation. See what he says. Interpretation is an educational activity which aims to reveal meanings and relationships through the use of original objects, first-hand experience, media, rather than simply to communicate factual information. So there's sense of place right there, meanings and relationships, meanings and attachments. The more recent updating of Freeman Tilden, the book by Beck and Cable, again, meaning, excitement, enthused and energetic, okay? So we have both place attachment, we have place meaning there. So these definitions of interpretation coming from whom I would consider to be the experts on interpretation are making that connection to place-based education. And the National Association for Interpretation, this is their definition that you can see on the website when you go to NAI, forges emotional and intellectual connections. So once again, place attachment, place meaning, sense of place. Place-based education, okay? And recent work in the interpretation literature, including a paper published by Bob Lilly last year, makes a more robust connection between this idea of interpretation and sense of place. And these are some of the quotes, okay? One purpose of interpretation is to enable visitors to develop a sense of place, emotional, intellectual connections. Study by Morgan on what was happening with the effects of an interpretive program. This paper actually showed that yes, interpretation could lead to measurably increased place attachment in visitors in this particular park. And then Bob's paper here in Legacy last year, fostering a sense of place or an appreciation of the meanings and attachments that people assign to locales is at the heart of interpreting geology. It ties cultural and spiritual values to geological features and processes. So again, it's this idea of both intellectual connection and emotional connection. That's what sense of place is. And so I think that formal educators in this room should get themselves familiar with interpretation, the idea of what interpretation is and what interpreters do. And on the other hand, interpreters, I would encourage you to look into sense of place, look into the books on sense of place and the research, because I think you'll benefit from it. Place-based education contribute to interpretation by some of the methods that we use, the evaluation methods we use. Again, a lot of these were adapted to our development of this interpretive exhibition at Grand Canyon. This is my graduate student, Becky Fruce, who is actually doing interviews with visitors out at Grand Canyon along the Trail of Time to see how well they were connecting with the park on both an intellectual and an emotional level. Interpretation can contribute to place-based education because of its passion and its love. Okay, the first thing that I tell people when they're asking me, I've had people, and this is not a problem in the Appalachian region because you have magnificent landscapes and incredible places to teach about. But there are people who teach from places where they think the geology is not all that visible. Okay, it's covered up, it's flat. And they say, they always say to me, they say, well, of course it's easy for you to talk about place-based education because you teach in Arizona. And my response always is, well, yes, well, I think anybody can teach in a place-based way anywhere, but the first criterion, of course, is they really do have to love that place. If you don't love the place, you're not going to be able to teach about it in a place-based way. And it really doesn't matter where that place is. You know, it can be the most flat, featureless landscape on the planet. If you love that place, you can teach about it in a place-based way. So I think that's about it. So I'll sort of leave it with that we have passion, and thank you very much.